and I'm going to be looking.
Okay. Okay, everybody, thank you for joining me today about the professional development on autism. I'm glad you chose my presentation today, and we're going to go through autism, and I want you to pay attention to everything that I'm saying, because as the teachers give an exit ticket, I want all of you to think about, while we're talking, something that you learned today new that you didn't know before. But I won't put you on the spot, and you're not on camera, so don't worry. But I do want you to think about what you do, you know, what I presented that maybe was something new that you learned, okay? All right, let's get started. So, many of us are personally touched by autism. Many of us have family members or neighbors or the students that you work with. So I know I've shared with many of you over the years, I've been in the district since 2005, that my nephew is on the spectrum. He's very high functioning, and he was able to get the help he needed later. He wasn't diagnosed until 11th grade. He was very, Asperger's is the diagnosis that was given years ago. We're going to talk more about that. But he is now, he graduated college, got a master's degree, is living with somebody, and it was a lot of work. It was a team effort, but he made it. So many of us are touched by it in the community. So as we go through this, I'm sure that it will bring up a lot of thoughts and hopefully be very helpful with your interactions with the kids you work with. So how it all began for me. That's me right there in my class in 1982 when I was an aide. Wow. And that's when my career began and my love of working with children with developmental disabilities began. So in this class, there were 12 students in 1982, 2 aides. There were no one-to-one aides at that point. It was classroom aides, and the teacher, Art, on the left, and Marcella and I. And back then in 1982, and I want you to think about the dates that I'm going to be giving to you. In 1982, all the children there were diagnosed as MR. That's mental retardation. Today it would be intellectually disabled. So when we're talking about the incidence of autism on the rise, I would say that probably 10 out of these 12 students were diagnosed on, would have been today diagnosed on the spectrum. So when we're looking at why is there an increase, that's part of the reason. Because a whole group of children that were once diagnosed intellectually disabled, they are now being, diagnosed as autistic. So, like I said, 10 out of these kids probably, would today be diagnosed on the spectrum. Oh, I wanted to go back. Okay, so also, how after I was a aide in a classroom, I had my children, and when I wanted to go back to work, I got my master's in special ed when my kids were in nursery school. I was an early intervention teacher where I went into the homes of children between the ages of birth and 3 years and worked with them. And then I got my job at Stony Brook, and I've been here since 2005 as a behavior consultant. So that's my journey, and it all began in this classroom. So autism spectrum disorder is called a spectrum disorder because people with ASD can have a range of symptoms. Individuals have a variety of strengths and difficulties. So we know that it's a broad spectrum. You know from the students that you see within this building that we have the 611, the 1211, the 15, ICT, mainstream. So there's a broad, spectrum of children that have a variety of strengths and areas of weakness. And if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. All the kids are a kid first with their personality, and their diagnosis is second, and everybody is different. Now we're going to meet Donald Triplett. And I want you to keep in mind, he was born in 1933. He'll be 90 this year. Donald Triplett is known as Case 1. He is the first person that was identified with the diagnosis of autism. Now, Donald Triplett was born in 1933 and demonstrated difficulties, and the parents were told to institutionalize him. And that's what was done in 1933. Well, his parents did do it at the age of 3. He was demonstrating all these behaviors, and they were very concerned, and they felt that the doctors knew best. But a year later, after they did place him in the institution, they took him out. And they did whatever they could to help him. Now, at age 5, they took him to doctors to try to find out a diagnosis, and Dr. Leo Canna, who is a psychiatrist, diagnosed him with what is called autism. Now, he brought it to the attention of the world in 1943. So again, 1933, now it's 1943. So when we think about people with autism, they have been with us forever. So it's not something that just started happening. It's that it took a long time for the diagnosis to be made. Now, how did the term autism come to be? Autism comes from the Greek word autos, meaning self. And this was first used by a Swiss psychiatrist who used it to describe the inner world that he saw his patients having, and that he was diagnosing schizophrenia. Dr. Leo Canna took the term and he applied it to what he saw when he saw the children having inward behavior and being self-absorbed, and he kept seeing these behaviors repeated and repeated within a group of children, and came up with this term to use as the diagnosis. So what about Donald Triplett? What kind of behaviors did he exhibit? He exhibited savant abilities in music, rapid mental multiplication, an interest in number patterns, letters, US presidents. So think about the kids you work with and what interests they have, and think about back then there were no computers or internet. So he was drawing on things of interest that were in his world. So he, he probably had a book on US presidents and was memorizing them. His language was unusual. He didn't play with other children. He had difficulty eating. He was spinning blocks, pans, and round objects, and had meltdowns, and echolalia, which is the repeating of phrases over and over again. He stood on tables, he put food in his hair, he chewed paper, he repeated 15 words he learned from the encyclopedia, he communicated only when he needed something to his family, and he categorized Time magazine by date of publication. So all of these behaviors you can see within the kids we see in school. Maybe they're a little different, but it's all along the same lines of repetitive behaviors, which we're going to get into. So what happened to Donald Triplett? They didn't say what happened for elementary school and middle school, but I'm assuming his mom advocated and had him in those. But he did go to the high school. He graduated from college with a degree in French, and he worked in a bank in a small town of Forest, Mississippi that was owned by his family. He learned to drive, and he traveled the world. So Donald was born in this small town where his parents owned the bank, and they were wealthy people, and they were well known, and he worked in the bank. Well, the whole community took him in. And that's a lot of the success also his family felt he made, because everyone watched out for him, and it was a small town, and everybody accepted his behaviors. I mean, obviously he wasn't doing the things he was doing in childhood, but everybody, took him in. And his parents felt that that's why he also thrived. So how did we learn about Donald Triplett? This woman, Karen Zucker, and her writing partner, John Donovan, she has a son on the spectrum, and she heard about case number 1, and she wanted to see if he existed and was still alive, and she found him. And she wrote a book, and there's a documentary if you want to see it on PBS. If you Google PBS and in a different key, it'll come up and you can watch it for free. And it describes his whole story and his journey. And again, they felt that it was really so important that the community took him in, and that that led to the success. So keep in mind all these dates we're talking about. 1933, he was born. 10 years later, the first diagnosis of autism. Now it's 1975. That is the first law that special ed has to exist for all handicapped children. And it required that all public schools accepting federal funding must provide education to children with physical and/or mental disabilities. 1975. Before that, children did not have to have any services. So that's, I mean, it's incredible. Before, the government placed absolutely no requirements on schools to educate those with disabilities. Most children were kept at home, or the family had to pay for private school. And many schools had laws excluding students who were physically disabled, deaf, blind, emotionally disturbed, and intellectually disabled. Now, how many of you went to the 6th grade assembly with the man who comes to talk to the kids in 6th grade? He was born, and I don't know, how old would you think he was? In his 50s, 60s? So he was born with legs that were short, and he needed prosthetics. But in the beginning, he didn't have that. And they were told he couldn't go to school. This man was told he couldn't go to school. Maybe he was, 60 now. Intellectually, completely intact, but there was no law that he had to be educated, and he was going to be kept home. And his mother fought for him to go to elementary school, if you heard his story. And he went, and he excelled, and he did gymnastics, and, had an incredible life. But here's a man telling us that he didn't even have to go to school. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that autism now is a part of our mainstream lives. It wasn't before. People didn't even know about it. So people in the community taking their children out, they probably kept them at home because they didn't want them to act out. Now in the media we have all these shows. The first movie was Rain Man, and that was very specific to a certain kind of autism on the spectrum. There's Atypical on Netflix, which is a great show if you want to see a family dealing with autism. Temple Grandin on HBO. Love on the Spectrum, which I love. It's people finding love on the spectrum. They take social skills classes and they find people. And Young Sheldon, The Big Bang Theory, and Jeff reminded me about The Good Doctor, which is on TV right now. So look at how far we've come in terms of how it's accepted and talked about, because it was a hidden thing, and the parents were told to put them into institutions, and now we have them represented, in everyday life. So the Center for Disease Control now says in March 2022 that 1 in 44 are identified on the spectrum. 4 times more common in boys. Now, last time somebody asked a question, why? Why not girls? And girls have stronger social skills. And they can hide it better. And they call that masking. So a lot of girls on the spectrum are able to follow along, the higher functioning girls are able to follow along and see what the other kids are doing, and they look like they're joining in, but if you look really carefully, they're having difficulties. I have a student that does have this and is trying desperately to understand what the girls in middle school can be pretty not friendly, and difficult. And she struggles with it, but she's in social skills classes and she's, trying very hard to fit in. But that's one of the things is the focus now today, they are investigating more that the diagnosis for women has been very low because they went under the radar, because so many people could mask it. But it is, more common, as you see in the classrooms that you work in, you see more boys. And why the prevalence of it? And I know people have talked about the vaccines. I'm not here to be political or just scientific. The science says it is not the vaccines, and we'll talk about what they feel it is. But there is a big reason, like I spoke of my classroom, when you think back to 1982, this red line is the intellectual disability. The diagnosis is going down, and the diagnosis for autism is going up. So less people are being diagnosed with intellectual disability as their main disability, and the main disability is autism. But that doesn't mean that you can't, and we'll talk about that, have intellectual disability with autism. It's the primary diagnosis. So we're going to go through an overview of autism, what causes it, how it's diagnosed, what are the characteristics, the most effective approaches for treating, and is there a cure? So again, talking about causes. Science has shown us that it is genetic and neurobiological. Now we have families that have a child on the spectrum and they decide that they're not going to vaccinate the next child, and the next child is on the spectrum. I mean, that's a big piece of looking at, there are countries that don't vaccinate children and there's still autism there. The primary thing that they feel, and studies have shown, and again, I'm not a scientist, but studies have shown that it is caused by a genetic factor and neurobiological. And how is it diagnosed? There's no blood test. There's no scan that can tell you of the brain that you have autism, and they are leaning at studies towards finding those ways of diagnosing it. But right now, it's called the DSM-5, and it's a criteria. So when you meet with a doctor, they're going to focus on these 3 areas and interview the parents and then do an observation of the child, and that's how the diagnosis is made. And also by the reports that teachers and you guys do in helping the teacher fill out those reports about their behaviors, because that is crucial. You spend most of the day with them and see them in the school environment. So an impairment of social interaction is one of the criteria. Poorly developed social skills. The second is an impairment of communication, difficulty with expressive and receptive language, and the third would be restricted, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behavior. So that is how it is diagnosed, with scales where they ask the parents questions and they fill things out. Then there's levels of severity. So many of us are used to the term Asperger's for the high functioning kids. How many of you have heard that term for high functioning? Well, they don't use that anymore. Now they call it level 1, level 2, and level 3. And that's how they're describing it. So level 3 would be requiring very substantial support, which would be like the 611 students. Level 2 requiring substantial support, and level 1 requiring support, which would be more of the higher functioning kids. And you know, with anything else like curriculums, with the pendulum, things change with diagnoses and terms, but we all know without these levels, you know, how the kids are functioning. So autism, like I said, could also have comorbidity, which means you can have something along with autism, like intellectual disability, anxiety. How many of the kids that we work with have anxiety as well? OCD, or medical issues. They're kids. They can have anything any other child has. They can have seizures, allergies, ADD, gastro problems, sleep disturbances. But oftentimes they're a little bit more pronounced with the children because they don't know how to deal with those feelings. So their behaviors come out more than children that can, you know, understand that they may be sick and need to take something. So again, they're kids first and foremost, and along with the diagnosis comes other things. So what are the characteristics of autism? Repetitive behaviors, sensory, language and communication, obsessive interests, social interactions, and executive functioning, which is the mental process that enables us to plan. So let's talk about repetitive behaviors and think about the kids that you work with. arm or hand flapping, finger flicking, rocking or jumping, spinning or twirling, complex body movements, and this is all known as stimming or self-stimulatory behavior. And these behaviors are often very soothing to the kids. They have a lot of anxiety, they can't process what's going on in their environment, and they engage in these behaviors to calm themselves down. Well, we all do this. How many of you twirl your hair? Or you tap your foot? My daughter shakes her foot. So we all engage in nail biting or something that calms us down, except ours are all socially appropriate in the world that we live in. These behaviors, if we started doing them to calm ourselves, it would look different. But as human beings, we all find something that helps us to calm down. So this is sensory. Who can find my little student? He earns to go in this sensory bag. He's in elementary school, and he just really likes to earn this, and it grounds him, and then he comes out, does his work, and then he goes back. So we're going to talk about sensory. Touch. Certain fabrics may be intolerable. Tags in clothing. Today I was in an elementary school class, I think he's in first grade, one of the students, and the tag was bothering him, and he took a scissor and cut it out. He was very good at it. I was a little nervous he was going to ruin his shirt, but he did a good job. But it was right there, right there. Now, my 2.5-year-old grandson slept over this weekend, and he couldn't take the tag in his pajamas bothering him, but he didn't have the language really to tell me, so he kept pulling in his pajamas until I said to him, "What's bothering you? Is it the tag?" "Yes." So when our kids don't have the expressive language to tell us what's bothering them, and they come in and something's tugging at them, or they're wearing socks they never wore, or, you know, any piece of clothing that's bothering them, they may have behaviors because they don't have the language to say, "Hey, this is bothering me." Then we have taste. Children eat the same thing every day. I know that the women in the cafeteria just like get so frustrated watching the kids eat the same thing every day. Well, they get it. Sometimes it's texture, sometimes it's taste, and sometimes it's habit. But the parents are just happy when they're eating, and they're not going to make that the first, war in getting them to eat. They're just happy that they're eating something. So we have to be a little patient with that, because as long as they're getting nutrition, the family feels okay, and they don't want to make a fight about it, because it's a lot of work to try to get children to start eating different things, and of course they should, but the kids can just be very tough to get them to try new things. We have hearing, the humming of fluorescent lights, or a child hearing somebody else, or I see a lot of times with headphones that somebody else can hear through the headphones. They hear it. So that's very distracting to them. Sight, overly decorated classroom can be very overwhelming. When we mainstream kids in elementary school for a period or two, we always take them into the class first to walk around and to experience it and to see it, because otherwise they're going to just go in that first time and just be looking around and not paying attention at all. And then smell. Certain odors can be a distraction to the kids. I know I'm highly sensitive to odors. My girlfriend, when she gets in the car with me, I have to tell her before I pick her up, don't put your perfume on, because it just totally annoys me. So, I can't. I went to a meeting with one of the school psychologists the other day, and she had one of those diffusers on with the air, and I was choking. I said, "I'm so sorry, but could you please, shut that off?" But I could use my language, I can be polite, and I knew that I had to do that. Our kids walking into a room and smelling that, and them having the reaction I had, and not having the ability to say, "Please, can you turn that off?" What might they act like? They might act out. So when you think about behavior and why it's happening, think about all the things that these kids can be having difficulty dealing with throughout their day. All of these senses, or maybe just one. It doesn't mean that all the kids are going to experience everything or all of them or one of them. I had one student with smell years ago, and he wanted to go to he was in elementary school, he wanted to go to the cafeteria, but he would like gag when he smelled all the different things, tuna fish, peanut butter. And we asked him, what do you like? He liked the smell of vanilla. His mother sent in hand lotion with vanilla, scent. And before he would go to lunch, he would put it on his hands, and when he felt like he was gagging at the table, he would just discreetly take a smell, and it calmed him down. So people have different strategies, and we have to try to help them. He was high enough functioning to be able to tell us that it bothered him, and he was willing to try something so that he could stay in the cafeteria. So language. Children diagnosed on the autism spectrum often have difficulty developing language skills, both expressive, which is saying things, and receptive, which is understanding. So I'm going to tell a little story about one of my students in middle school. She's in a 1211, but mainstreams for health, and she came out of her class across the hall from health. She was going to have health in another couple of periods. And she said to her teacher, I hate health. And it was like, where did this come from? Well, her aide spoke with her, and she got what happened. She didn't do her health homework, and she was nervous to tell her teacher. So she role-played with her aide and came in and was prompted to talk to the teacher, explained it to the teacher, and everything was okay. But even though she's higher functioning and has language, she wasn't able to say that. So what came out of her mouth was like totally, different. It wasn't anything to do with that she didn't have her homework. Repetitive and rigid language, echolalia, the use of stock phrases from movies or from games they play. I know all of you have experienced that with the kids. It's not effective language. It's not telling us anything. It really feels good to them to repeat the phrase. Narrow interests, exceptional abilities, so their vocabulary can be very high in an area where they're interested. Let's say they're very into science. They can talk about everything they learned, but you can't have a conversation with them about something else. And you're really not having a conversation about the high interest. They're telling you. It's a one-way street. And some children may be able to read words, but not able to comprehend it. So I know many of you have kids that are reading really well. They read the words, but they're not understanding it. Those are two different skills. You can decode words, but it doesn't mean you're understanding it. And comprehension comes into everything all day. Math has word problems, science, so it's very difficult. Then many kids have obsessive interests. Many kids have intense and highly focused interests from a very young age, and they can change over time. It's not always the same. Thomas the Tank used to be like one of the mainstays. I don't know if it is anymore. Specific topics in history, cartoon characters, volcanoes. Very often they'll just want to talk about that, and it's very satisfying to them. But again, it's not communication effective communication. And then the social interactions are affected. Pragmatic language is the language used for social interaction. And this includes language, body language, how we move our body and reading how a person is feeling. It involves idioms and slang that we learn through observation. The English language is really difficult, and all of us have just learned it as we've grown. But this is a big area of deficit for them. And they're very literal. Often the use of volume, tone, and intonation are difficult. Many of your kids just scream, and they don't even hear themselves and are not aware of that volume level. Problem solving and expressing their emotions, and perspective taking. This is a big one, perspective taking. They don't understand how their behavior is being viewed by others. That's what keeps us all in check. All of us are thinking, what's that person gonna do? Think if I do that. they don't have, most of them, I'm not going to say all, but most of the kids don't have that perspective taking. So when they're having that meltdown in the hallway or in the classroom or in the cafeteria, they have absolutely no idea how it is affecting how their peers or their teachers are interpreting that. And again, I want to go over the literal thinking. Don't drink and drive. I had a student who was screaming at his father on the Long Island Expressway because the sign popped up, don't drink and drive, you know, on the expressway, the lit up signs, and he was drinking water. But literally, don't drink and drive, the nuance of alcohol wasn't there for him. So when you think about the kids you're working with, if they're literal thinkers, you really have to be aware of how they're interpreting what you're saying. Does that make sense to everybody? Because it's a true deficit. And, you know, idioms, I'm feeling under the weather. If they take that literally, they don't even understand that. Or, I'll give you a penny for your thoughts. I know these are a little old-fashioned, but the point is, you know, taken that don't spill the beans, we're making daddy a surprise party. And all their brain is thinking about beans and spilling them. They're not understanding that. Now, all of you were not taught, don't spill the beans, and what it meant. You got it because language came naturally to you and it wasn't a deficit. But for them, think about their day at school and think about all the things that they're contending with throughout their day. And language is a huge piece of people talking to you. If you're not really totally understanding it, that's stressful. And social interactions. Many times it appears that children don't want friends or they're not interested in their peers. Maybe they don't understand what their peers are saying or doing. I mean, I have a very high-functioning kid on, you know, the spectrum, and he wants to be involved with his peers, but you could see if you really observe him that he's not 100% getting what these boys are talking about. And it worries me for him because he's innocent and he just can be taken advantage of at some point because he wants to be part of it, but he doesn't quite get it. So are they laughing with him or are they laughing at him? And that's something that is a very big part of your jobs, to observe these things and see what's going on and report it, because at this age in middle school, it could be really difficult for them. The social interactions may be too stimulating for them. I look at what goes on in the cafeteria here at Howard, and even in the elementary school. It's like, it's overwhelming to me, the noise and what's going on. And they may have no interest in what others are interested in because their interests don't align a lot of the times. They're not into the whatever the kids are, you know, talking about, the latest video or that. They may be into my cue to stop. They may be interested in things that are immature. How many of your kids might still be into watching something that they don't want to admit to their peers, but they're still going home and watching a cartoon that was a favorite when they were 3, 4, or 5. And that's okay. But then they don't have, you know, the ability to chat with the kids about whatever they're talking about. So a lot of the times, recess is a time for them to reset, to walk around the playground. They may be alone, but they're resetting because they've been on all day. It's, you know, in their classes. They need that time. Or they're just sitting in the cafeteria here and they open up their Chromebook and they just stay to themselves. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. We have to respect their needs. And then we talk about executive functioning, and I know many of you say this to me. How can he not know this routine anymore? You know, or when he comes back from a vacation, or why doesn't he get this? We do it every day. Well, executive functioning is the ability of skills planning, staying organized, sequencing information, and regulating their emotions. And, you know, they don't remember things all the time, and they're unable to follow directions all the time, and some of them need visual cues. And we have students that still, by the time they leave Howard, still are having an aide as a, their helper to tell them, well, where are we going next? And in those moments, it's good to show them their schedule and let them at least look at it, because that's at least making them a little bit more independent than an adult telling them what to do or where to go. But it's a real issue. It's not like they're coming here, saying, I don't remember, and they're making it up. Okay, so what interventions are there? Early intervention is from birth to 3 years. Most often that's like what I did, and I went into people's homes and worked with the kids on their den floor, their living room floor, and worked on basic skills, play skills, labeling, trying to elicit language. Then it moves to 3 to 5, which is your county, New York, you have to provide an education. And there are preschools, special ed preschools. They can go to a regular preschool with a SEIT, which is a special education itinerant teacher. And all of these things are, guaranteed through your school district if they qualify for being delayed. ABA. ABA is a very highly structured form of teaching for certain children. It's not for everybody. A one-to-one approach. Life skills are offered, functional academics, vocational preparation, and higher education for students that it's appropriate for. Positive behavioral supports, those are the visual cues that you see, using timers, all the strategies, using a chart for them. Those are the positive behavioral supports. Social skills, that they go to their counselors, they have social skills groups. Many families take their children outside of school to social skills groups. We have the OT, the PT, and of course medications. But what I want to stress is, there is no cure. There are interventions to lessen the symptoms. So when you hear some of these actresses on TV and they're talking about, I cured my son, it's either they were never on the spectrum at all, it was a misdiagnosis, or they're not cured, but their symptoms from all the therapies and all the interventions help them to function more appropriately. So when you hear that, it's not something that can be cured. The symptoms, lessen. So challenging behaviors. We've gone through everything. Everything that we've talked about, we see the stuff on top of the iceberg, right? Everything we talked about is under the iceberg. That's why their behaviors come out, because they've got communication issues, they've got social skills issues. And that's what's underlying all of it. So when we're seeing the kids in distress, I want everybody to keep in mind all of the behaviors are coming from something. Behavior is communication. It's not just coming from no place. And oftentimes we're detectives in trying to figure out, is it a sensory issue? Is it a language issue? And when we can figure those things out, it helps us to work on the behaviors. So now I'm going to put you guys on the spot. I want to hear what you learned new about autism. Nobody be shy. I won't put you on camera. Nobody learned anything new?
We don't use Asperger's. We don't use Asperger's.
Okay, so the comment was we don't use Asperger's anymore. And it's a shame, because it really does, and the community of people on the spectrum, if you go online, they still use it. And people who are in the know still use it, because it does describe well a subset of people on the spectrum. And everybody understands. Yep.
Why did they stop using that?
Because they went into this level, and it must have to do with something in terms of, you know, it being easier for insurance purposes or something to, you know, clarify it. I'm not 100%, you know, sure. Anything else? Come on.
Learn the history of how we'll, like, that diagnosed.
Right.
Case. I never knew about that.
Okay, so learning about the history and about how there was case number 1. I found that fascinating, and of course that's why I put it in here, because it really was very, you know, interesting to learn about that. How was it, you know, come to be formally? How many of you were really surprised at how there were no services for so long, till 1975? Did everyone here realize that? Show of hands, did you know it? You knew that.
A lot of issues.
Hmm?
That's true for a lot of other diagnoses.
Right, true for a lot of diagnoses. Yep.
Did that all have to come with the whole Willowbrook thing?
Well, Willowbrook definitely was a huge thing where how do you pronounce his name? Rivera, Geraldo. Okay, said it. Yes, he blew the lid on, and think about the people that were in Willowbrook. They could be your students because they just sat there doing repetitive behaviors because no interventions were given to them at all. So they just withdrew more and more into themselves, and they weren't asked to do anything. There was no, you know, any demands placed on them or expectancies of them. So that's why they got more withdrawing. Yes, that is absolutely true. Any questions?
I wanted that the ID diagnosis went down and the autism diagnosis went up. That was interesting.
Right, so the ID diagnosis went down and autism was going up.
Many people were misdiagnosed.
Correct, because there wasn't that diagnosis. And also there's better diagnosis now. There's very, you know, some kids are very nuanced, like you have to really know your stuff to know. And high functioning people that never get diagnosed are those quirky people that you meet along the way. I have somebody at Stop and Shop where I live, and my husband always makes fun of me because I talk to everybody, and he's my pal. He stands where they, I mean, he's very high functioning. He lives on his own. He has 2 dogs, Dachshunds, and I know his whole life. But he might not have been diagnosed. I just pick up, you know, on his quirkiness, and that's okay. You know, my nephew, right now, if you met him, you would just think he was a little quirky. But, you know, so there's that whole other group that are diagnosed now that adds to the amount of people being diagnosed. Anything else that anybody learned or a question?
So what types of medications? Are there medications that?
Okay, so the kind of medications, there is no autism medication, okay? So the question was, you know, I'm just saying it for the camera, you know, what medications are there? There is no specific medication for autism. What is given is for attention deficit if they do have that with autism. But again, it doesn't always work the same way for a child that's strictly, you know, ADD. There's anxiety medication for kids on the spectrum who have terrible anxiety. So those would be the 2 key ones that they use. And for very, very, very behavioral kids that are not in this setting, that are in other settings, they have very heavy-duty medications to help those children not self-abuse themselves because they bite themselves, you know, or hit their head against the wall. So for those kids, they have come up with medications now that are very effective and helpful. But there is no, you know, medication that is an autism medication. But that was a good question, thank you.
Can a student, can a child go from level 3 to level 1? Like, will level 1 like regress?
I think that would be with interventions lessening, like we talked about, the symptoms. So I have kids that might have presented in elementary school as a significant, you know, very significant, and now in high school, they're graduating and they don't look anything like they look. They still have autism, but they're going to need help the rest of their lives, but not at the level that it was when they were young. So yes, there's improvement, and if they were diagnosed later, you know, they might be diagnosed at a different level.
So that same kid who, you know, we put in all those interventions, like you said,
Mhm.
and starting in elementary in a certain way, and graduate from high school. If those same things aren't being done for them all the time, do they regress?
So the question was, all the symptoms that they have, do they regress if it's not kept up? For certain children, yes. You know, it depends on where they fall on the spectrum. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, for instance, like for my nephew, he went to a special school for 12th grade, a private school, a boarding school that we sent him to. The family, you know, helped my sister and he went there. And he had a high level of therapy there. Every day he saw a therapist. And when he transitioned out of that program to college, he had the therapist once a week. And there were times he stopped going to therapy, but he's now back in therapy, you know, because he felt the anxiety from, you know, getting a new job or whatever, and so he uses his, you know, skills to know when he needs the help. But kids that are, you know, low functioning, you know, in terms of needing supports, visual, to make them as independent as they can be, we change the visuals as they age. So when they're little, the visuals look very picture maybe, and as they age, it looks more mature and something that would be appropriate for their age. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
What if parents usually do with kids very low functioning, like when they get older? What do they typically do when they're no longer around? Like, the parents usually.
When the children are, you know, needing very, very substantial support, they usually go to a group home setting, because family is, you know, years ago, families took in their siblings and, you know, kept them within the family. Today, in our world, it's less so, with taking in our parents and you know, certainly children with difficulty. And it is a big problem, because many times in the past, these families that are now having, they're 80 or 90, so their kids are 50, let's say, okay? They've never been anywhere but their parents' house. The parents are getting sick and they're dying. And these people are then going to a group home at this age, and at first they're depressed and it's a very difficult transition for them. And then they like it, because they get taken out, they go to, you know, they have a whole world that's open to them than just being home. And in the end, they end up taking care of their parents. They know how to do the laundry, or they'll do something for the mother. So it would have been better if they placed them in the group home when they were young, and they acclimated it to it with the family, and the family took them out on weekends and they were used to it. But back in the day, people didn't, you know, feel that that was good. A lot of families get very creative, and they have friends that they meet in kindergarten, and their kids are all friends, and they make a group home together, and they manage it. So my friend did that with her son. So, you know, you can get creative. There are other living situations for adults. There are apartments that, for higher functioning, that are supervised, and a social worker is there for a crisis, you know, living in another apartment, but there, you know, there is that help within that. So you have to get creative. That's the bottom line.
You know, just adults fall in love.
Watch Love on the Spectrum.
It's so good.
Can autistic adults fall in love? Yes.
Sometimes they have like such a barrier.
Love on the Spectrum is a reality show.
Yeah, Love on the Spectrum is a reality show, and it's real people, you know, falling in love and making that connection.
I just feel like they're so to themselves. Like my nephew, he's high functioning, went to college, he flew and he lives in Arizona and he lives alone and he has an accounting job. But he just stays home and watches TV all the time.
Right, so
Not interested in women or anything.
right, so her nephew doesn't see, you know, that as an option, you know, it's not an interest of his, but he is functioning and he's happy, And he would have been a bachelor, like somebody that we just said, oh, Uncle Joe's a bachelor, he never got married. Like, that's who your nephew would have been. He has a job, he lives independently, we have to accept all of our children. We have to parent the child we have and love the child we have. And no matter whether their interests and their life takes on what we thought, if they're happy, we should be happy. You know, we can't place what we think the value is on, you know, my nephew and his girlfriend decided they're not having children. And my sister's thrilled because if they feel they shouldn't have children, then she's honoring, you know, she'd like more grandchildren, but that's their wish and their life. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Anything else? We're good? Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us for autism, and goodbye.